So as we now have completed a fairly complex project, I hope you were able to solve all, most if not all, of the challenges a part like this presents you. You know that to do the bolt hole circles involved a little bit of trig. You had to long-hand it. This presented some challenges where you want to make sure to get the slug out of the middle. If you haven't done that, that's something you might want to consider on future jobs. Because if you leave a piece of metal and by just going around the periphery you're leaving a slug in there, that might break your cutter off. So a few tricky challenges here on this part. So what I'd like to do now is review the G-codes that this controller has, and that will bring up some extra discussion on some additional features that we're not necessarily going to spend a great deal of time on, but I want you to know that they're out there, that there are indeed many G-codes that act to make your work much easier out on the floor when you're programming. So if you go to page 12 of the manual, you'll see we have the beginning of a list of G-codes that we'll find on this control. And we also have what are called modal groups. If you recall, G-codes remain in effect until you change them. And what changes them is another G-code that's in the same modal group. So here is an example of modal group 1 G-codes. G00, G01, 02, and 03. You're familiar with all of those. We've just worked with those extensively. And they're in group 1, so a G01 would override any one of these. 03, 02, and 00. But a G01 will not change the modality of a G20, for example. The only thing that will take a G20 out of inch mode is a G21 metric command, because they're in the same modal group. Okay? Because they're in modal group 6, they override each other, but they have no effect, nor does that G-code affect any other modal group. So here's the list of different G-codes. So G00, 1, 2, and 3, we know and we beat to death over the last several hours of practice that we've been doing here. G02.1 and G03.1 are commands that are only available on our advanced control, but what they involve in the use of is spiral interpolation. So something, if you can picture the path of a circular interpolation going in as a spiral that can be either conical or cylindrical. In fact, you would use that for thread milling as well. So those are very advanced G-codes, and we're not going to go through every one of these. Anytime you program a G04 with a value, G04 P10, that's a 10-second dwell you're asking for. Just in the program, all on its own, you use a G04. A couple other noteworthy commands are here, beginning with G17, 18, and 19. These are plane selections. By default, the control and all of the things we've been doing have been working in the X and Y plane. But you can make your primary axes to be the X and Z plane or the Y and Z plane by issuing G18 or G19 command. That will override your normal X and Y plane. And plane becomes important when you're talking about things like circular interpolation and cutter compensation. You need to know you're in the right command. G20, G21 we know about as the inch, our metric command. These G20s are not used on most machines. G28 is a nice one that you want to remember. And what that does is sends the machine axes to their home position. So if I say G28 X, Y, Z, what it's going to do, and don't even need to enter a value, or you could say G28 X0, Y0, Z0, it's going to send those axes to the machine home position. That's usually where people do tool changes. So when people do a tool change, they'll issue a G28 prior to the TO1 MO6 command. So there's a couple of them there you might want to make note of. Other commands involve polar coordinates. Those I don't see used as often, so really just know that they're there and that not everything has to be a Cartesian coordinate, okay? When you take this advanced course that we're going to produce called Advanced Milling, we'll be talking about cylindrical coordinate systems which come into play when you're using rotary table. On the next page of GCodes, we go roughly. These are very useful G-codes right here, so put a note around G34, 35, 36. These three commands and G37.1 are very, very useful because that bolt hole circle that you had to calculate out using trig, G35, or rather G34, would have allowed you to do an entire bolt hole circle without doing any trigonometry and simply specking out the number of holes in your circle and the starting angle, and it would have done all the calculation for you. Likewise with holes that you drill at an angle, maybe a series of holes along an angular line, that's what G35 does. All you have to do is tell it how many holes, the starting location of the first hole, and the angle that it is in the x-axis, and it will drill up along those holes. G40, 41, 42 you've used, those are important. G43 is usually the only one I use for the Z. There's other possibilities here, but you won't see those used too often. You'll see the G43 more often than not. Sometimes you'll see a G44. But as I said, those others, 43.1, 45s, etc., not used too often. And then here's our working planes, G54, 55, 56, or rather our workpiece coordinate systems. Those are worth remembering, okay? Those are relevant to which coordinate system you're at, especially if you're on a horizontal mill, where there'll be multiple workpieces chucked up on a tombstone. You'll want to use plenty of these work coordinate systems. Going off to our next page of G-codes, the ones that really come into play are from G75 through G88 and G89. Those are all the different fixed cycles that we kind of talked about, the most of them in this session. There's 90, 91, those are absolute. And the rest of these, not too critical to remember, other than G98 and G99. Those work within the fixed cycle and have to do with the R level. I'll refer you to the manuals for this, but just know that these two are useful to prevent an R level from being too high up and having to cut a whole lot of air. Now, what we're going to talk about in the advanced cycles, in our advanced class, would be many more of these G-codes which relate to the operation of advanced functions like cylindrical coordinate systems and such. But we've gone through, as I said, there's many techniques, there's very much more to programming than we've actually had time to cover. The purpose of this series of courses, of sessions, was to give you enough information so that you have a broad-based understanding of what's involved in soup to nuts related to machining, machine setup, and machine programming of vertical milling machines. So please join us for the next sections on turning,